The snow fell gently over the quiet town of Brimfield, Massachusetts, a place that seemed almost untouched by time. Nestled between endless stretches of pine trees and blanketed hills, the town was no more than a speck on the map, known mostly for its antique fairs and cozy winter charm. But for those who lived there, Brimfield was home, where community mattered, where neighbors knew each other by name, and where every winter brought the same peaceful routine. Yet, for the last 4 years, one sight had puzzled and captivated the townsfolk every Christmas Eve. A small orange tabby cat, sitting alone by the edge of Clover Lake, staring intently at the frozen surface as if it were waiting for something or someone. The cat had no name, no collar, and no home anyone could claim. It simply appeared one year during the holiday season and had since become part of the town's traditions. Children would leave scraps of food for it near the lake's edge, and older residents would mutter theories about its mysterious behavior. Some said it was waiting for its owner who had abandoned it. Others believed it had been drawn to the lake by tragedy, clinging to a memory buried beneath the ice. No one truly knew why the cat returned, but it always did. And every year, it braved the bitter cold, its small body hunched against the wind, its amber eyes fixed on the unyielding expanse of ice. Among the townsfolk, one man in particular took notice of the cat. Tom Barrett, a middle-aged widower and Clover Lake's unofficial caretaker, felt a strange pull to the feline. A former firefighter, Tom had retired early after a house fire claimed the life of his wife, Sarah, 6 years earlier. He lived alone now in a small cabin not far from the lake. His days spent shoveling snow, chopping wood, and keeping the lakefront clear for the occasional winter visitors. But his nights were quiet, achingly so. Christmas, once his favorite time of year, had become a season he dreaded, a stark reminder of what he had lost. Tom first noticed the cat 4 years ago during one of his nightly walks around the lake. At first, he dismissed it as just another stray. But as the years passed, he began to realize there was something almost ritualistic about its presence. It wasn't scavenging or wandering aimlessly like most strays. No, this cat had a purpose, though Tom couldn't fathom what it might be. Still, he found himself drawn to the little creature, bringing scraps of turkey from his lonely Christmas dinners and sitting quietly beside it, the two of them staring out at the lake in companionable silence. The lake itself had its own reputation in Brimfield. Stretching nearly half a mile wide, Clover Lake was a local favorite during the warmer months, its crystal-clear waters reflecting the endless sky above. But in winter, it transformed into something otherworldly. A frozen expanse of silver and blue, its surface marred only by the occasional crack or snowdrift. And beneath that frozen surface, the lake held secrets. Everyone in town remembered the tragedy from 5 years ago, the drowning of little Emma Larkin, a bright-eyed 6-year-old girl who had fallen through the ice during an unseasonably warm December. Her body had been recovered days later, but the loss left a scar on the town, and on her family most of all. Emma's mother, Linda Larkin, had once been the heart of the community, known for her warmth and tireless energy. But after Emma's death, she withdrew from the world, her laughter replaced by quiet sobs and distant stares. She rarely left her house anymore, and when she did, she avoided the lake altogether. Her husband, Dan, had tried to bring her back, but even he struggled with his own guilt, having been the one to let Emma play too close to the ice that day. Their grief was a wound that refused to heal, and the lake, once a source of joy, had become a place of pain. Tom had known the Larkins well. He'd been the one to pull Emma's body from the lake, a memory that haunted him still. And though he hadn't spoken much to Linda since the tragedy, he often thought of her, wondering how she endured the weight of such loss. Perhaps that was why he felt such an odd connection to the little tabby cat. Like him, it seemed drawn to the lake by something it couldn't let go of, its loyalty unwavering despite the cold and the passing years. This Christmas Eve was no different. As the sun set and the first stars began to prick the darkening sky, Tom bundled up in his heavy coat and scarf, a thermos of coffee in one hand and a tin of leftover ham in the other. He knew the cat would be there. It always was, and sure enough, as he rounded the bend in the trail that led to the lake, he saw it. A small orange figure perched at the edge of the ice, its tail curled neatly around its paws, its ears twitching against the wind. "Hey there, buddy," Tom called softly, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The cat turned its head briefly, acknowledging him with a slow blink before returning its gaze to the lake. Tom smiled faintly as he approached, setting the tin of ham on the ground a few feet away. He lowered himself onto the frozen grass beside the cat, unscrewing the lid of his thermos and pouring himself a cup of steaming coffee. For a while, they sat in silence, the only sounds the distant whistle of the wind and the faint creaks of the ice shifting beneath the snow. Tom found the quiet comforting, even if it was tinged with sadness. He glanced at the cat, its amber eyes unblinking as it stared at the lake, and wondered, not for the first time, what it was waiting for. Or who. The night deepened, and the stars multiplied, casting their cold light over the frozen expanse. Tom shivered, pulling his coat tighter around him, but the cat remained still, as if the cold didn't bother it at all. And then, just as Tom was about to pack up and head home, something strange happened. The cat stood up. It wasn't the slow, languid stretch of a lazy feline, but a sudden, purposeful movement. The cat's ears perked, its tail flicking once as it took a few tentative steps onto the ice. Tom froze, his heart racing. The lake wasn't safe this time of year, hadn't been since Emma's accident. He opened his mouth to call the cat back, but the words caught in his throat as the tabby paused, its head cocked to one side as if listening to something only it could hear. "What are you doing?" Tom whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. The cat turned its head to look at him, its amber eyes glowing in the starlight, and then it stepped further onto the ice, its paws making no sound as they touched the frozen surface. Tom's pulse quickened as he scrambled to his feet, the tin of ham forgotten. Something about the cat's movements, its focus, its determination, sent a shiver down his spine. It wasn't just wandering, it was leading him somewhere, and deep in his heart, Tom knew this Christmas Eve would be unlike any other. Tom's boots crunched on the snow as he followed the orange tabby onto the ice. His breath quickened, sending small clouds of vapor into the frigid air. Every instinct screamed at him to stop, to turn back. He knew how dangerous the lake could be, especially in late December when the ice, though thick in places, could still hide treacherous weak spots. Yet something about the cat's unwavering determination tugged at him, a silent plea he couldn't ignore. "Hey, buddy," Tom called softly, his voice trembling, more from unease than the cold. "You shouldn't be out there. Come back." The cat didn't so much as glance back. Its little paws moved steadily, barely making a sound against the ice. It stopped momentarily, its head lowering as it sniffed a faint groove in the surface, a crack in the ice, half covered by a dusting of snow. Then, as if assured of its path, it pressed onward. Tom hesitated, glancing back toward the snow-covered shoreline. His cabin was just a few minutes away, warm and safe, with the remnants of a fire still glowing in the hearth. A sane man would retreat to that comfort, leave the cat to its mysterious rituals. After all, it had survived this long without his interference. And yet, there was something about this moment, a pull he couldn't explain, as if stepping away now would mean losing something far greater than just a stray animal. With a resigned sigh, he adjusted his scarf and took another cautious step onto the ice. His boots slid slightly, the frozen surface unforgiving beneath him. "If I fall in because of you, you better have 9 lives to spare. You hear me?" he muttered. The cat continued its steady march, pausing only occasionally to sniff the air or glance ahead. Tom followed at a safe distance, each step calculated, his ears straining for the telltale groan of ice under strain. The lake stretched endlessly before him, a stark white void illuminated by the pale glow of the moon. Somewhere beneath his feet lay frigid water, dark and silent, a graveyard of secrets. As they ventured further, Tom's mind began to wander, unbidden memories surfacing like ghosts. He thought of Emma Larkin, her bright smile and infectious laugh. He'd known her well, as did everyone in Brimfield. She was the kind of child who could light up a room, who left behind a trail of giggles and mischief wherever she went. The day she drowned had been one of the hardest of Tom's life, not just because of the loss, but because he had been the one tasked with retrieving her from the icy depths. He could still feel the cold seeping into his bones, hear the anguished cries of her mother on the shore. He'd carried that memory like a weight ever since, a reminder of his own failures. Lost in thought, Tom almost didn't notice when the cat stopped. It stood perfectly still, its tail flicking once before curling tightly around its body, its head tilted to the side, as if listening to something just beyond human hearing. "What is it?" Tom asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He took another careful step closer, his eyes fixed on the small animal. The cat crouched slightly, its muscles tensing as though preparing to pounce. But instead, it let out a soft, mournful meow that sent a chill down Tom's spine. And then the ice beneath them groaned. The sound was low and guttural, like the belly of a beast awakening from slumber. Tom froze, his pulse pounding in his ears. For a moment, everything seemed to hold its breath. The wind, the trees, even the stars above. Then came the unmistakable sound of cracking. Tom's heart leapt into his throat as he spotted a jagged line splintering outward from beneath the cat's paws. "No!" he shouted, his voice echoing across the stillness. He lunged forward, ignoring the protests of the ice beneath him, and scooped the cat into his arms just as the crack widened, the surface sagging ominously. He turned and ran, his boots sliding with every step, the cat clinging to his chest as the ice groaned louder, threatening to give way beneath him. His breath came in ragged gasps, his lungs burning with the effort. Just as he reached the shoreline, the ice behind him let out a deafening snap and collapsed, sending a surge of water spilling over the edge. Tom stumbled onto solid ground, collapsing onto his knees. His arms trembled as he set the cat down, his heart still hammering in his chest. "Are you insane?" he gasped, looking at the little creature. The cat blinked at him, completely unfazed, before letting out another soft meow. Tom shook his head, a half laugh, half sob escaping his lips. "You really are something, you know that?" He sat back, trying to catch his breath, when he noticed the cat wasn't looking at him anymore. Its eyes were fixed on something behind him, back toward the lake. He turned, expecting to see nothing but the dark expanse of water and ice. But there, just beyond the edge of the collapse, something shimmered faintly beneath the surface. At first, he thought it was just the moonlight reflecting off the water. But as he squinted, the shape grew clearer, a glint of silver, tangled in the murky depths. Tom's stomach twisted. He knew what it was before his mind could fully process it. A bracelet, delicate and small, with tiny charms dangling from it. One of the charms, a butterfly, caught the light just so, and his breath hitched. Emma's bracelet. Tom had seen it before, clasped around the little girl's wrist as she twirled in her favorite red coat. It had never been recovered after the accident, lost somewhere in the depths of the lake. And yet, here it was, almost as if it had risen from the depths to remind the world of what had been lost. His hands trembled as he stared at the shimmering object, a wave of emotion crashing over him, grief, guilt, and something else he couldn't quite name. The cat let out another soft meow, drawing his attention. It stood at the water's edge, its tail flicking back and forth as if urging him to act. Tom swallowed hard, his throat tight. He didn't know how the cat had known, how it had led him to this moment. But as he looked into its amber eyes, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Tom sat frozen on the snow-covered bank, his wide eyes locked on the faint shimmer beneath the icy waters. The bracelet glinted faintly, just out of reach, and yet its presence seemed impossibly close, like a whisper from the past brushing against his skin. Emma's bracelet, the memory of her tiny wrist, adorned with the butterfly charm, flickered vividly in his mind. He clenched his fists, fighting against the tide of emotion threatening to overwhelm him. How had it come to this? How had the stray cat, of all things, guided him here to this exact spot on Christmas Eve? It felt absurd and miraculous all at once. He glanced down at the orange tabby, now seated calmly by his side, its amber eyes reflecting the moonlight. There was something otherworldly about its expression, a knowing that sent chills through Tom's already cold body. "Why?" he whispered, his voice breaking. "Why did you bring me here?" The cat tilted its head but said nothing. It didn't need to. The answer was written in the quiet insistence of its gaze, in the mournful meows that seemed to echo with unspoken truths. This wasn't just about the bracelet. It was about the guilt that Tom had carried for years, the invisible chains that bound him to the lake, to Emma, to that horrible day when he'd failed to save her. Tom inhaled deeply, the icy air burning his lungs. The surface of the lake was still now, the broken ice crusted with frost, as though nature herself sought to cover the scar. But he couldn't turn away. The bracelet gleamed beneath the water, a tangible reminder of a life cut short. If there was any way he could retrieve it, any way to give Emma's parents, and maybe even himself, a shred of closure, he had to try. He stood slowly, his knees stiff from kneeling in the snow. The cat rose with him, brushing against his leg as if offering silent encouragement. Tom glanced back toward the shore, toward the safety of solid ground, and for a moment he wavered. The lake was dangerous, especially at night, especially alone. He could fall through just as Emma had, and there'd be no one to save him. But then he thought of Linda Larkin, of the hollow look in her eyes whenever he passed her in town. He thought of how she deserved something, anything, to ease the unrelenting ache of her loss. And he thought of Sarah, his wife, who had always told him to follow his heart, no matter where it led. Tom made his decision. "Stay here," he murmured to the cat, though he doubted it would obey. He stepped cautiously back onto the ice, his boots crunching softly against the frost. Each step felt heavier than the last, the weight of his own fear pressing down on him. He tested each patch of ice with the toe of his boot before shifting his full weight, his heart pounding with every creak and groan beneath him. The spot where the bracelet shimmered was just a few feet from the edge of the collapse. He knelt carefully, spreading his weight as evenly as he could, and peered into the water. The bracelet swayed gently with the current, tantalizingly close but still out of reach. He removed his gloves, wincing as the bitter cold bit into his skin, and rolled up his sleeve. "Come on," he muttered, leaning forward as far as he dared. His fingers grazed the edge of the opening, the icy water numbing them instantly. The bracelet was so close. He stretched further, his chest pressing against the ice, until his fingertips brushed the delicate silver chain. His breath caught in his throat, almost there. Just as his fingers curled around the bracelet, the ice gave a loud, ominous crack. Tom froze, panic surging through him as he felt the surface shift beneath his weight. The lake groaned in protest, the sound reverberating through the still night. He pulled back quickly, clutching the bracelet in his trembling hand, but it was too late. The ice beneath him splintered, and with a deafening crash, it gave way. Tom plunged into the frigid water, the shock of the cold stealing the breath from his lungs. For a moment, the world was a blur of darkness and freezing pain. His arms flailed instinctively, desperate to find something to hold on to, but the ice was slick and unyielding. The weight of his soaked clothes dragged him down, the cold seeping into his bones like death itself. No, he thought, panic clawing at him. Not like this. Above him, he heard a muffled sound, a frantic yowling that cut through the water's icy grip. The cat. He looked up through the broken surface and saw the small orange tabby pacing at the edge of the hole, its cries sharp and insistent. It darted back and forth, its movements wild with desperation, as though it understood the gravity of the situation. Tom's fingers found the edge of the ice, and he clawed at it with all his strength. His muscles screamed in protest, his body heavy and sluggish from the cold, but he refused to let go. "Help," he choked out, though there was no one to hear him. His vision blurred, the edges darkening, and for a terrifying moment, he thought this was it, that he would join Emma beneath the lake, swallowed by the same icy grave. Then, something incredible happened. The cat leapt onto the ice beside him, its small body barely making a sound. It approached the edge cautiously, its tail lashing as it studied him with an intensity that seemed far too human. Then it crouched low and extended a paw, its claws hooking into the sleeve of Tom's coat. It pulled, just a tiny, almost imperceptible tug, but it was enough to jolt Tom's senses back to life. Fueled by sheer willpower, Tom summoned the last of his strength and hauled himself upward. The ice cracked further beneath his weight, but he managed to drag his torso onto the surface, his frozen fingers scraping against the frost. The cat stepped back, giving him room, its cries urging him on. With one final heave, he rolled onto solid ice, coughing and gasping as the cold air burned his lungs. He lay there for a moment, shivering uncontrollably, the bracelet still clutched tightly in his hand. The cat nudged his shoulder with its head, a soft, reassuring gesture that felt like a lifeline. "Thanks," he rasped, his voice barely audible. "I owe you one." The cat meowed in response, its amber eyes gleaming with something Tom could only describe as relief. It stayed by his side as he crawled back to the shore, never straying more than a few steps away. When they finally reached solid ground, Tom collapsed onto the snow, his body trembling with exhaustion and cold. He stared up at the sky, the stars swirling above him, and let out a shaky laugh. He'd done it. He'd found the bracelet. The cabin glowed faintly in the distance, its windows spilling warm, golden light onto the snow-covered yard. Tom stumbled toward it, the orange tabby trotting faithfully at his side. His clothes were soaked and clung to his body like a frozen second skin, each step a battle against the icy grip of winter. But the small object in his hand, the delicate silver bracelet, kept him moving. Its tiny butterfly charm glinted in the moonlight, a fragile reminder of why he'd risked everything. The cat seemed to sense his struggle. It meowed softly, weaving between his legs as if urging him to keep going. When they finally reached the porch, Tom collapsed onto the wooden steps, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His hands trembled violently, the cold making it difficult to hold onto the bracelet, but he refused to let go. "Almost there," he whispered through chattering teeth. The cat leapt onto the steps beside him, its amber eyes fixed on his face. It nudged his arm gently, and for a moment, Tom swore he saw something in its gaze, something deep and unfathomable, like gratitude or understanding. Gathering the last of his strength, Tom pushed himself upright and stumbled through the cabin door. The warmth hit him like a wave, the crackling fire in the hearth beckoning him closer. He set the bracelet carefully on the coffee table before collapsing into a chair, his body shaking as the heat began to thaw his frozen limbs. The cat padded inside after him, its tail held high as it surveyed the room. It settled near the fire, curling into a tight ball but keeping one eye on Tom. For a long time, he simply sat there, staring at the bracelet. Memories flooded his mind, unrelenting and vivid. Emma's laughter echoing through the woods, the way she chased butterflies near the lake's edge, her small hand gripping his as she tugged him toward some new adventure. And then the memory of that awful day, her red coat vanishing beneath the ice, the frantic cries of her parents, the unbearable silence that followed. Tom wiped a hand across his face, his eyes stinging with unshed tears. He hadn't cried in years, not even after Sarah's death. But now, sitting here with Emma's bracelet before him, he felt the weight of it all, the grief, the guilt, the endless what-ifs, crashing over him like a tidal wave. The cat stirred, letting out a soft chirp that broke the silence. It stretched lazily before hopping onto the arm of his chair, its warm body pressing against his side. Tom glanced at it, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "You're not just any stray, are you?" he murmured. The cat blinked slowly, a gesture that felt strangely comforting. As the hours passed, Tom began to feel a sense of clarity he hadn't known in years. The bracelet wasn't just an object. It was a connection to Emma, to the family that had been shattered by her loss. He thought of Linda and Dan Larkin, of the empty house they lived in, the Christmas lights they no longer bothered to hang. For years, he had avoided them, too ashamed of his failure to face their grief. But now, holding the bracelet in his hand, he realized he had something to give them. Something small but meaningful. The next morning, the town of Brimfield was quiet under a fresh blanket of snow. Tom bundled himself in warm layers and tucked the bracelet into his pocket before heading out. The cat followed him, its paws making tiny indentations in the snow as they walked through the woods toward the Larkin house. It was a modest home on the outskirts of town, the kind of place that once radiated warmth and laughter but now seemed cloaked in sorrow. Tom hesitated at the edge of the driveway, his heart pounding. He glanced down at the cat, which sat patiently beside him, its tail flicking against the snow. "You think this is a good idea?" he asked. The cat meowed softly as if to say, "Go on." Summoning his courage, Tom approached the front door and knocked. The sound echoed in the stillness, and for a moment, he thought no one would answer. But then the door creaked open, and Linda Larkin appeared. Her face was pale and drawn, her eyes hollowed by years of grief. She stared at him in silence, her expression unreadable. "Tom," she said finally, her voice brittle. "What are you doing here?" He swallowed hard, suddenly unsure of what to say. I found something," he said, pulling the bracelet from his pocket. He held it out to her, his hands trembling. "I thought you should have it." Linda's eyes widened as she stared at the bracelet. For a moment, she didn't move, didn't speak. Then, with a trembling hand, she reached out and took it. Her fingers brushed the butterfly charm, and a sharp, broken sob escaped her lips. "Emma's," she whispered, her voice cracking. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she clutched the bracelet to her chest. I don't know how it ended up where it did," Tom said, his own voice thick with emotion. "But it felt like it was meant to be found." Linda nodded, her shoulders shaking as she wept. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for bringing this back to me." Tom stepped back, giving her space, but she surprised him by reaching out and taking his hand. Her grip was firm, her eyes searching his. "You've carried this with you too, haven't you?" she said softly. "The guilt, the pain." He nodded, unable to speak. "Emma wouldn't want that," Linda said, her voice steadying. "She wouldn't want either of us to carry it." For the first time in years, Tom felt a flicker of something he thought he'd lost forever. Forgiveness. Not just from Linda, but from himself. He nodded again, this time with a faint smile. "Merry Christmas, Linda," he said. She smiled back through her tears. "Merry Christmas, Tom." As he turned to leave, the orange tabby appeared at his side, trotting along as if it had been waiting for him all along. He glanced down at it, his heart lighter than it had been in years. "Come on, buddy," he said. "Let's go home." That Christmas, for the first time in years, Tom didn't spend the evening alone. The cat curled up by the fire, purring softly, as Tom sipped hot cocoa and watched the snow fall outside his window. He thought of Emma, of Sarah, and of the fragile but unyielding threads that connected them all. Life was fragile, yes, but it was also full of second chances, of small miracles waiting to be discovered. And as the cat blinked up at him with its wise, amber eyes, Tom realized that sometimes, even the smallest creatures can lead us back to what matters most. The snow had stopped falling by midnight, leaving the world outside Tom's cabin still and quiet. Inside, the fire crackled gently, its warm glow dancing on the walls. The orange tabby lay curled on Tom's lap, its tiny body rising and falling with each contented breath. Tom rested a hand on the cat's soft fur, his thoughts drifting back to everything that had happened over the last 24 hours. The bracelet now sat on the mantel above the fireplace, its butterfly charm glinting in the firelight. It no longer felt like a symbol of loss, but rather a testament to connection, between past and present, between grief and healing. Tom thought of Linda, of the way her face had softened as she clutched the bracelet to her chest, as if holding on to Emma once more. He thought of how her tears had not only been ones of sadness, but also of something he hadn't seen in her for years: release. For Tom, too, the weight on his chest felt lighter than it had in years. Emma's loss would always leave a scar, but he no longer felt crushed beneath the burden of guilt. The lake, once a place of unbearable pain, had become something else entirely, a reminder of resilience, of the capacity for love and forgiveness to emerge even from the darkest of places. He glanced down at the cat, which blinked lazily up at him, its amber eyes catching the glow of the fire. "You knew, didn't you?" Tom murmured, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Somehow, you knew I needed this." The cat let out a soft purr, leaning into his touch. It was as if it understood, as if it had been waiting all these years, not for the lake, but for him, for the moment when he was ready to face his pain and find the strength to let it go. Outside, the stars sparkled in the crisp winter sky, their light reflected in the frozen expanse of Clover Lake. The town of Brimfield slept peacefully, unaware of the quiet miracle that had unfolded on its edges. But for Tom, the events of this Christmas would forever be etched in his heart. He had been given a second chance, a chance to heal, to reconnect, and to believe in the possibility of something greater than himself. As the fire crackled and the cat purred softly, Tom whispered a quiet prayer of thanks to Emma, to the cat, and to whatever force had brought them together. Christmas, once a season of loneliness and loss, had become a season of hope. And for the first time in years, Tom felt something stir in his chest. A warmth, a peace, a fragile yet enduring joy. This Christmas, he wasn't just surviving. He was living.